In this tutorial, you will learn how to make a traditional bias binding using a bias binding maker. But make sure to watch till the end because I will show you an alternative way so you don't have to spend money on tools you might not use that often, or if you cannot find the right size. If this is something you would like to learn, then keep on watching. Bias binding is essentially a strip of fabric that is cut on bias, also referred as a bias tape. Bias is the 45-degree angle across the width of the fabric. Why would you cut it on bias? Well, fabric cut on bias has some stretch and is more elastic, which is essential quality of bias binding, especially if you are sewing around the curves. Bias binding is used to cover the raw edges of the fabric. It can be visible and decorative, as you can see on this needle book, or an easy way to finish a vulnerable edge that isn't visible on the outside. For example, in a place of a facing on a neckline. I don't have a sample here, but bias binding is often used on unlined jackets or dresses, when a Hong Kong finish is used as a method of binding the seams. In bag making, bias tape is used not only to cover the raw edges, but also to provide some structure and stability to the finished project itself. A skeleton that holds the shape of your bag or a pouch by providing support to the seams. Bias cut strips of fabric are also used to make a piping, which then can be used to decorate pillows, dresses, curtains, bags, and other projects. I have a separate video tutorial on how to make a piping, in case if you want to find out more. Bias binding comes single folded or double folded. Single folded means that the sides are folded to the middle and pressed flat. Double folded is essentially a single folded bias binding that is folded in half an extra time. Ready-made bias binding is available in different sizes and colors, either pre-cut in pieces that are individually packed, or you can buy it by the meter. The size of the bias binding refers to the distance between the folds and not the full width of the unfolded bias tape. Typically, ready-made binding is made from a polycotton or satin. But when making your own bias binding, you can use any type of fabric you want. I would highly recommend using a fabric that is made from natural fibers, because you will need to press the folds with an iron and you don't want the fabric to melt. Also, choose a lightweight to medium weight fabric to reduce the bulk at the seams. What if you cannot find exactly what you need for your project? Well, in that situation, you can make your own bias binding. You already know that to make a bias binding, we need to cut strips of fabric that are cut on bias. But how wide those strips or fabric should be? Well, first you will need to work out the width of your binding. Then ask yourself if you want a single fold or a double fold bias binding. When making a single fold binding, take the chosen width of your binding and multiply it by 2. As an example, if you want to make a 2 centimeters bias binding, you will have to cut a strip of fabric that is 4 centimeters wide. Why, you ask? Because you need that additional amount of fabric to create those folds so they can meet in the center. It's also always good to add a couple of millimeters to account for those folds. When making a double fold bias binding, the width of the binding must be multiplied by 4. So to make 2 centimeter bias binding, you will have to cut strips of fabrics that are 8 centimeters wide. So if your binding is 2 centimeters, you'll need to fold it in half, and then you have to have those two edges fold it inside like this. Again, add a few millimeters to account for those folds, but also take into consideration the thickness of the seam. As you can see, there is a difference of the thickness between a bag when you have to stitch 4, 6 or even 8 layers of fabric, and something like this needle book or maybe a quilt when the thickness of your finished seam isn't that big. So take that into consideration as well. Before you cut your fabric strips, you need to find the 45 degrees angle on your fabric. To do this, you can either use a protractor or those diagonal lines on a quilting ruler. Next, place the 45-degree line on the ruler along the selvage of the fabric. Selvage is this tightly woven edge that runs along each side of your fabric. Often you will find information about the fabric designer or a company here. So align that 45-degree line at the selvage. Then you can use a tailor's chalk or other marking tools and just draw a line. Just like that. This is the easiest way to find the bias, especially if the fabric wasn't cut straight in the shop. But what if the fabric you are using does not have the selvage edge? Well, in that case, you will have to find the grain of the fabric. The easiest way is to pull on the thread where the fabric frays just at the edges. Or you can just cut a fabric just at the end and rip it. This will waste a little bit of fabric, but at least you will have a straight edge here, which then can be used as a reference to mark your lines. If you don't have a protractor or a quilting ruler, first you will need to square off the edges of the fabric. So cut them perpendicular to the selvage edge, so they have a 90 degrees angle here. And then you can take one corner and bring it diagonally over to the other side. Then you will have to line up those edges here, and this diagonal fold is the 45 degrees fabric bias. So you can just press that with an iron or your fingers to create a crease, or just draw a line. If you are using scissors to cut your fabric, draw parallel lines using a desired width of your binding strips. I want my strips to be 5 centimeters wide, so I'm going to draw lines that are 5 centimeters apart. Then I can cut the fabric along those lines. If you have a rotary cutter and a healing mat, you can speed up this process because you don't have to draw those lines. Instead, measure the required width and place the ruler along that 45 degrees edge, and then you can cut one strip at a time. Do you always have to cut the fabric on bias? No, you don't. If you are going to sew a straight seam, then you don't really have to cut the fabric on bias. Instead, cut it horizontally or vertically. This way, you waste less fabric and you don't have to worry about joining those shorter strips together. When you have all your fabric strips ready, you'll need to join them together to create one longer piece. To do that, take 2 pieces and place them right sides together at the 90 degrees angle, just at the ends. Don't worry about those uneven ends here. We will trim them once we attach those 2 pieces together. Now you can just use a couple of pins to hold that in place. And then we're going to stitch from that corner going towards this corner. So what I like to do is to just draw a line just like that. So now I know exactly how I'm going to stitch those 2 pieces together. If you want, you can do it one by one, or you can just carry on, take another piece, place it on top, again 90 degrees angle, pin it. Now you can take this to the machine and we're going to stitch all those pieces together. When you have all those pieces joined together, you're going to take your scissors and we're going to leave about 5 mm seam allowance. So basically you can just trim that excess. And then what I like to do is just to cut away those triangles at the end as well. So I just follow the straight edge of my strips, just like that. Now you can open the seam allowance, just like that, and press it flat. Here we go. This way we created a nice long piece of bias tape. Bias Binding Maker is a fantastic tool to speed up the process of making your bias binding. They come in different sizes and you will have to pick the correct size based on the finish width of your bias binding. So for me, I'm making a 2.5 centimeter bias binding today. So I'm picking the biggest one that I have. You can purchase individual sizes separately, or you can buy a multiple sizes in one pack. So to use your bias binding maker correctly, lay your bias tape with the wrong side facing up. Then it is best to have one end of your bias strip cut at the angle, just like that. Then you're going to insert that end into the slit. So you're going to insert that inside and just push it inside. If you have a difficulty, you can use a pin or a needle, and there is this groove here when you can just insert your needle and push the fabric till you see the end of your fabric here. Once you have that end, you're going to pull on your fabric and you will notice that the strip begins to fold on each side. So you just lay it flat, hold it with your fingers, and you can just pull on that bias maker. So when you have enough fabric, you can just start pressing it with an iron. So you can grab it by the handle here or just here and just pull the maker straight and move your iron. So it looks something like this now. So you have two ends folded and they are meeting perfectly in the middle. So carry on doing it till you finish the entire bias tape. If you want to make a double fold bias binding, you will still use this tool to make the single fold, and then you will have to fold that piece in half to create double fold bias binding. You may have noticed that ready-made double fold bias binding is not folded exactly in the center. As you can see, one side is about 1 or 2 millimeters longer than the other. This is to ensure when you wrap your fabric between those two pieces and you're stitching it from the top where the shorter end is, you can catch the bottom as well at the same time. So now to make a double fold bias binding, you will have to fold this piece in half, just shy of a center. So leave 1 or 2 millimeters longer edge underneath. And then you can just press that flat. And carry on till you make the entire bias binding. But what if you don't have bias binding maker, or maybe you cannot find the right size? In that situation, the easiest way is to draw a center line on the wrong side of your strip. So I have a 6 centimeter strip here and I'm going to mark it in the center. So you would do it along the entire length of your strip, and then you can just simply fold those ends and bring them towards that line in the middle. On one side, you would press it, and then you would take the other side, bring it towards the center as well, and then again press it. Here we go. This way you can create a custom bias binding in any width, even if you cannot find the right size of the bias binding maker. See you next time. Stay crafty, friends. Bye.